was asked to explain the process in an accessible way of what we're all doing here. So I'm going to try to do that. So from what I understand so far, I've been on a fact-finding mission trying to figure this out, and I'll tell you what I have discovered so far. It's incomplete. My understanding is that in 1992, the countries of the world, or many of them anyway, came together for the first time in Rio de Janeiro, and they called it the Earth Summit, and it was because scientists had put out a warning saying something feels really bad about the environment, we should all talk about it. And out of that came a legally binding agreement called the Framework Convention, the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. And that convention from 1992 still stands. They've been meeting every year since, and so this is the 27th gathering of the parties that signed that convention. So that's why this is called COP, the Conference of the Parties 27, the 27th iteration. Since then, only twice more they've managed to all agree on a legally binding text. So we have two more agreements. The Kyoto Protocol was in 1997, and in 2015 we had the Paris Agreement, and last year was the Glasgow Climate Pact. But so the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and the original convention, they are the three agreements that people are still discussing and implementing and checking in on every year. So the short form of those are COP, COP, that's for the convention, CMP, that's for the Kyoto Protocol, P for protocol, and CMA, A for agreement, for the Paris Agreement. So what you see here is lots of meetings, negotiations and informal sessions that have these acronyms. That's what they're meeting on. They're meeting to talk about articles under the CMA, the Paris Agreement. And so these negotiations are the core of what happens here. This is the core of why people have gathered, but the only people with a role and who can speak in these negotiations are representatives of countries, and they are called party delegates. They come to represent countries individually, but also countries band together to form negotiating blocs. And sometimes these blocs exist out there in the world beyond the COP. So the European Union is one example of a bloc of governments that create policy together. And some have come together just for the COP process. So an example of that would be AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, who realized they'll have more influence when they put their voices together, or the LMDC, the like-minded developing countries, so you have a number of these. They're the ones with a formal role in the negotiations. And then around it, so these are here, you can notice there are people with the pink badges that says party on it. I have a yellow badge, I'm an observer. That's the majority of people here, and they are here representing civil society. So they are members, parts of NGOs and other organizations, often with specific interest groups in mind. So they'll be representing young people, or indigenous peoples, or farmers, or labor unionists, trade unionists, or business, and all of these civil society organizations, all of these observer delegates are grouped together under constituencies, they're called. These are categories of interest groups in civil society. There's 9 of them, and the ones I just mentioned are examples of them. And they have the formalized role of holding to account the representatives of governments that are talking here. So they can hold to account, they can lobby and say, hey, don't forget about us, don't forget about this perspective, but they don't have a formal role at the negotiations. So they can attend open sessions, informal sessions, but they cannot be in closed meetings where they discuss certain outcomes for this COP. So this COP is an example of one where we won't see a big agreement coming out. That's not the intention. They are talking about implementing the Paris Agreement. So we will expect that they're talking about, this has been happening in a lot of planes flying over. Everybody's had to stop on their panels, take a breather. So right now what we are listening out for are certain agenda items under the Paris Agreement and other different agreements. So loss and damage was a big one on the agenda, and we want to hear a decision made about it. It has been made, so that's really a good start for an outcome. People are going to go back and set up an institution, probably under the UNFCCC. I'll explain in a second what that means, to implement technical support and advice for countries affected by climate change and communities affected by the climate crisis. So people on the front lines being compensated, first of all, technical advice, maybe finance later, I don't know, for loss and damage already. Okay, so remember the UNFCCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was the first treaty that they formulated and signed in the Earth Summit, the first one in 1992, Rio de Janeiro. It is also the name for the UN body that was set up to help support governments that signed this treaty to implement and follow the rules of this agreement. So UNFCCC is the convention, and then the UN body is also called the Climate Secretariat, or just the Secretariat. And so we are in the offices of the Secretariat in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh right now, and the purpose is for them to support. So it's not to tell countries what to do, which is very important, which is, as we learned in the Kyoto Protocol, countries don't like that. So there's two main ways that they do that. So underneath the UNFCCC sits the SBSTA and the SBI. The SBSTA is the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. So that's one way that they advise. And then there is the SBI, the subsidiary body for implementation, which is another way of advice. So how can governments now implement the rules and agreements made and the plans made in their own countries. And then underneath that you've got a number of constituted bodies that help with specific interest groups, let's say, that are represented in the COP process. So you have a team supporting on adaptation, you have a team supporting on mitigation, but you also have a team that is dedicated to supporting representation of indigenous peoples in the COP process, for example. Right, so that's back to the observers and the constituencies. So that's the people with the blue badge that you might see around here at COP.
Tell us about global stocktake.
Right.
20 seconds.
I'll tell you about the global stocktake. So what happened when they agreed on the Kyoto Protocol is that they wanted a top-down process of making sure that countries were upholding their pledges on actions they would take on climate change. That's something that one of the biggest players, the United States, Bill Clinton, couldn't pass that in Congress, I think it was, so he couldn't implement it. So they learned from that, and in 2015 the Paris Agreement was different in that the climate plans from governments are on a voluntary basis. So sovereign states decide on their own what they are going to do in their countries. They are supported by that by scientific and technological advice from the UN and from the implementation subsidiary body. But these NDCs, they're called nationally determined contributions, are nonetheless on a voluntary basis, and they only need to be updated every 5 years. So what happens in between those 5 years? Who holds people to, who holds governments to account on whether they're actually delivering on their climate plans? One way that this happens within the COP process is there's a global stocktake, and this is countries, but also uniquely observers. Remember, we don't have a seat at the negotiating table here, but they do have a seat at the global stocktake, and this is a process which happens twice a year at COP, and then in June in Bonn, in Germany, to hold governments to account on progress, to check in on progress, to ask what are good examples, what are good practices, what has worked, can you share it with us, share experiences, and to ask for advice and support where needed. So that's what the global stocktake process is about, and that's hosted by the UN. So this is one of those functions of supporting. The final thing that I wanted to add, which is a new thing that I've learned this year, is that the reason that so I wanted to attend some of these negotiations to see if I could get in as an observer and watch. And it was explained to me that the first week would have been a really good time for that, because that is when they're tabling proposals and countries are giving their respective views on them, and these things are called informal consultations, and this is open to observers as well to watch. These informal consultations happen mostly during the first week, and that is also because in the first week is when the two subsidiary bodies, the SBSTA for scientific and technical advice and the SBI for implementation advice, when they have their agendas to get through. And then that translates into, this is a new term I learned, conclusions, which are not legally binding. They are advice, and so countries can adopt them or do whatever they want with that advice, and so it is very complicated and very complex, and it still gets political, but it's not quite as political and controversial as the things that happen in the second week, which are not conclusions, they are decisions. And these decisions are legally binding. And this is why once the SBSTA and the SBI close their agendas after the first week, so then their bits are done, the advice parts, in consultation with party delegates, that's when the ministers are flown back in. They come back, or they give, in any case, briefing to the negotiating teams that are here, who are often civil servants within the relevant ministries, to say, okay, these are the sticking points, this is what remains on the agenda that couldn't be worked out during the first week of negotiations. This is going to be passed into the second week, where we're going to have difficult conversations and a lot of compromise and a lot of negotiating, and they give the instructions on what are the hard lines, what is up for compromise, etc. And so this then leads to decisions. And so what comes out of this COP is something called the cover text, and those are a series of legally binding decisions made here amongst the parties that talk about various items and articles that have previously been written down but not quite fleshed out. And so that's what's happening this COP, that's what's been happening here. I'm recording this as I walk towards the exit on the final night, or what should be the final night, but it's not, because negotiations haven't finished. I just left, said goodbye to my friends in the UN office who are wrecked, and they are staying into the night to support the negotiators, parties. And so it's feeling very anticlimactic. A lot of the pavilions have started packing up today. People are really exhausted. The agenda has not been completed at all. A lot of stuff is still being debated and will get debated late into tonight and then into tomorrow and probably into Sunday, which is tricky because this is seen by some as a deliberate tactic to get rid of the observers and a lot of the developing countries who can't afford to stay longer. And at one point quorum won't be there anymore, so then they need to pack up. So yeah, a feeling of anticlimax as we're all heading out for the exit. That's the final bit of understanding how the COP process works. I've got a handle on the very basics on the very last night of the second year. I've attended one of these, and yeah, the jury is out.